Good morning, everyone. Just to welcome you all once again on behalf of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce for its 18th Sri Lanka Economic Summit, being held on the theme on the fast track to a turnaround. Welcoming you all today is the Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Rajendra Tyagaraja.
A very good morning to all of you. On behalf of the leadership of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, let me first extend a warm welcome to all of you to the Sri Lanka Economic Summit 2018. This has been organized for the 18th consecutive year, and we take great pride to position this as the signature event in the annual calendar of events of our chamber. This year, the summit will revolve around the theme on a fast track to a turnaround. 2018 to date has seen a weaker local economic growth, rising global commodity prices, and uncertainty regarding global trade, perhaps also partly fueled by the inwardly looking US economic policies under the Trump administration. Against this backdrop, locally we have been fortunate to achieve the resumption of the GSP Plus concession from the European Union, and also seen the first signs of the China Belt and Road Initiative-centric investments into the country. It is appropriate that we deeply delve into areas such as trade, investment, and services that will help turn around our economy while also learning from successful companies and steering reforms of our public sector and bureaucracy to work more effectively to successfully face emerging challenges. During the next 2 days, a full house in excess of 450 registered participants will benefit from 6 well-structured thematic sessions with a pool of more than 40 eminent presenters, panelists, and moderators from government, policy think tanks, and the private sector. We've also recognized the need for urgent public sector reforms to energize the bureaucracy, and also dedicated a separate session to bring together 6 leading chambers to identify common issues of national significance and engage the government with one voice. That will be tomorrow. On Friday afternoon, we had the closing session with the Honorable Ranil Wickremesinghe, Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, to whom we will present a summary of the key outcomes from each of the 6 sessions and engage in an interactive panel discussion with the leadership of the Ceylon Chamber. In compiling our findings, we also intend including audience responses to specific session-based issues and questions. Hence, your active participation in all sessions and objective opinion feedback via the conference app is extremely important to us. It's now my pleasure to warmly invite Mr. Arun Kumar, CEO of KPMG India and former Assistant Secretary to the US Commerce for Global Markets, who will be formally introduced by Savitri to deliver the keynote address after the formal introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tyagaraja, for the welcome and also for taking us through very briefly on what to expect in the next 2 days. Our keynote speaker is Chairman and CEO of KPMG in India and is an accomplished global executive with experience spanning multiple sectors from high technology to government in many geographies from Silicon Valley to India. He served as the Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Global Markets and Director General of the US and Foreign Commercial Service in the Obama administration. He led the trade and investment promotion efforts for the US government and served as the International Trade Administration's lead official advocating for better market access to US exporters. Before his tenure in public service, he was a partner and member of the board of directors at KPMG LLP. He led the firm's West Coast management consulting practice, serving major global clients as well as emerging Silicon Valley ventures. He also founded and led KPMG's US-India practice. A Silicon Valley entrepreneur and founding CEO and CFO of 3 technology ventures, he has been a mentor and advisor to a number of new ventures in Silicon Valley and India, a member of advisory councils at Stanford University and the University of California, Santa Cruz, an early charter member and board member of TIE Silicon Valley. He has a master's in management from the Sloan School of Management, MIT, and a bachelor's in physics from the University of Kerala in India. Please welcome our keynote speaker and CEO of KPMG India, Mr. Arun Kumar.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. Chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Rajendra Tyagaraja, dignitaries, members of the audience, friends. Well, good morning. It's a great honor for me to be here, and it's always a pleasure to return to your beautiful country. I will share today some observations gained from my time as an official in the Obama administration dealing with trade and investment, and then what I've seen in the last 18 months in what's happening in India, just to the north, where I lead, as was mentioned, KPMG. On my first visit here, just a couple of years ago, representing the US administration when I served in Washington, I related an episode of trade from Sri Lanka's history. Ice used to be cut from the frozen lakes of New England, significantly from Walden Pond outside Boston. The ice was covered with salt and sawdust to lower the melting point, and then would be shipped out to Sri Lanka and India. On the return voyage from Sri Lanka, the ship would carry graphite, which would then be used in lead pencils that American schoolchildren would write with. So Walden Pond, as you know, became famous when Henry David Thoreau, the philosopher, wrote his book Walden. It turns out that Thoreau himself worked in his family's pencil factory, shaping Sri Lankan graphite into pencils. This is, to my mind, a story of connections, the connections we find in our world. Everyone and every country is connected in some way. No man is an island, said John Donne, the English poet. We are all connected with one another. And this applies not just to people. It applies equally to an island nation. In today's world, more than ever before, we need to be connected, ideally with open economies operating according to common rules. This connectivity has the force to be at the center of any economic strategy in today's world, and applies even more to Sri Lanka given its geographic situation. 8 years after the end of a long civil unrest, the Sri Lankan economy has grown on average at a rate of 5.8% per year. While there have been signs of a slowdown in the last 3, from a peak of 8% in 2009 to 3.1% in 2017, there are many indicators to suggest that things do look bright from here on. There are a few matters to keep in mind when we discuss what needs to be done. In the 70s and 80s, investment in the tradable sectors led the productivity boost. Post the Civil War, investment was mainly driven by mega-scale public finance infrastructure projects and did not seem to result in immediate productivity gains, because reforms to enable the business environment lagged. Sri Lanka's static export structure signifies an absence of competitive forces to drive trade dynamism, innovation, and diversification. For over 2 decades, exports have remained concentrated on garments, tea, and rubber products, with a declining share in global trade. Introduction of para-tariffs barriers during the last decade has effectively doubled the protection rate, making the present trade regime one of the most complex and protectionist in the world. Despite operating a complex and expensive system of tax incentives to promote investment, FDI remains low. However, over the last couple of years, efforts are being made to transition the economy from a predominantly rural-based economy towards a more urbanized one, oriented towards manufacturing and services. To that end, Sri Lanka's new Vision 2025 sets out a course of reforms to make the country more competitive and lift the country's standards of living. Structural weaknesses limited export performance, constrained public finances, and regulatory barriers to investment are some of the macroeconomic issues which have impacted growth over the years. So, what are the aspects we consider? Let me discuss 5 topics that are interconnected. First, trade, especially exports. With a domestic market of only 20 million consumers and a modest per capita income, Sri Lanka needs an aggressive external trade policy to fuel its resurgence. External trade is critical to small countries and to large countries. When you are a small country, the challenge is that it is not possible to build prosperity just with a small market. Whether it is Sweden, with half the population of Sri Lanka, or South Korea, with 2.5 times the population, it is clear that exports are critical to growth and prosperity. I can tell you that in the United States, the largest economy in the world, I served as President Obama's lead official to increase exports and inward investment. We saw exports as critical to the growth of employment. Trade is thus one of the most critical reform areas to be addressed on the path to a turnaround. Regional integration is a key element to facilitate such trade. Second, investment, especially FDI. There is an urgent need to catalyze domestic investment and attract FDI in order to grow and create more jobs. Sri Lanka attracts a much lower volume of FDI than peer economies. Sri Lanka can take a leaf from India's book. There, a liberalized FDI regime with automatic approvals, with some exceptions, has resulted in India becoming a prime destination globally for FDI. Third, connectivity, policies and investments to promote regional cooperation and integration should be a key strategic priority. Such integration should extend to energy, logistics, transportation, communications, and harmonized standards. Fourth, investment in growth-oriented infrastructure and logistics is imperative to make Sri Lanka an economic hub in South Asia. Finally, balancing geopolitical partnerships, specifically with those with China and India. First, we talk about trade. External trade is imperative for Sri Lanka to achieve high growth, as I just mentioned. External trade depends on being competitive. According to trade policy indicators recently developed by IMF, Sri Lanka's trade and FDI regimes are more restrictive than the average emerging markets across key areas. These restrictive policies translate into weakness in trade competitiveness. In particular, the country is more distant from the emerging market average in the categories of trade facilitation performance and ease of starting a business. Instead, in both areas, Sri Lanka should aim to do very well. The World Economic Forum's Enabling Trade Index 2016 scores Sri Lanka at 4.1 out of 7 due to market access, tariff rates, and tariffs faced in destination markets. An abundance of literate labor is a major asset and has got to be the basis of Sri Lanka's comparative advantage and trade. Trade increased and economic growth and per capita income surged. The rationale for economic openness in Sri Lanka is therefore compelling. Back in 2005, trade accounted for close to 80% of GDP. Today, it hovers around 50%. Moreover, a significantly high state participation in the economy has had implications on competitiveness in a number of sectors and labor market dynamics. In addition to mastering trade, the country also needs a more diversified export basket beyond garments and cash crops, and foreign investment into the more productive manufacturing and services sectors that are linked to global value chains. And these should be not just with the US and Europe, where the bulk of Sri Lanka's trade is directed today, 45% of exports. This is largely due to the preferential access that Sri Lankan exports get in these markets through the generalized system of preferences. The GSP should not become a long-term dependency. It is important to become competitive without the support of the GSP. Furthermore, the GSP itself should have encouraged Sri Lanka to seek greater preferential access in other markets by striking trade deals. But surprisingly, Sri Lanka's FDA dossier is limited to only 6 bilateral deals. One that's been completed with Singapore, and then the ongoing negotiations with India, Pakistan, Israel, Iran, and Egypt. So this leaves a vast untapped potential in the neighborhood, including what can be achieved by creating comprehensive links with what is today the 3rd or 5th largest market in the world, depending on how you measure it, and that is India. India is now a $2.5 trillion economy, and it just surpassed the UK in terms of its size. And I can tell you that after spending the last 18 months in India, I see it as an opportunity-rich environment. In fact, I tell people in the US that I have not seen a place with such opportunities as India has today. It compares only with what I used to see during the dot-com days in Silicon Valley back 25, 28 years ago. So there's a lot of potential in having India in your sights. So clearly, putting all this together, Sri Lanka has a lot of work to do in the area of trade. In order for an economy the size of Sri Lanka to be able to generate and sustain economic growth, inward investments, and lowering of barriers to competition in key domestic sectors will be important. The new trade policy, approved in July 2017, aims to stimulate growth by improving the ability of firms to export and to compete in the domestic market through a modern, liberal, simple, transparent, and predictable trade regime. And let me share some observations on this. It is critical to recognize the importance of trade capacity building. According to the economic census, 99% of all establishments in the country are micro, small, and medium enterprises. Enabling the SME segment to export in global value chains by helping increase the ability to compete in export markets is a fundamental step. The legal system has to be modernized. Countries like the UK, US, Canada, Australia, Singapore, and now India have successfully incorporated alternate dispute resolution mechanisms, ADRs, into their legal systems. Legislation should be enacted to empower judges to vigorously encourage civil litigants to resolve their disputes using these alternate mechanisms through channels like mediation, negotiation, arbitration, and reconciliation. Training opportunities should be created for those who are interested to learn the skills necessary to serve as ADR professionals. Developing adequate compliance infrastructure is also a requirement. Strong commercial law and intellectual property protection mechanisms, especially in the above areas, are incredibly important for improving the ease of doing business. This will in turn increase FDI and smoothen operations for local companies. Sri Lanka can, of course, also look towards working with development institutions like the UNIDO, the ADB, the World Bank for assistance. The revival of Sri Lanka's cinnamon trade in terms of market share, redefining standards and competitiveness, is a good example of the results of such past assistance. Sri Lanka has had its share of successes. The government's role in promoting and orchestrating the tourism sector, especially in the areas of price competitiveness and safety, is an example. Trade facilitation measures, such as a single electronic window, will help reduce transaction costs of the cross-border movement of goods, thereby enhancing trade competitiveness of the economy. Such measures will most importantly also lead to better integrating Sri Lanka into the region. Improving physical connectivity between South and Southeast Asia has long been recognized as a key element in promoting greater trade and investment linkages within the region. In India, Prime Minister Modi has stated that a nation's fortunes are linked to its neighborhood. No nation is too large to not need her neighbors. Measured by intra-regional trade in goods, capital, and ideas, South Asia is the least integrated region in the world. Intra-regional trade as a share of total trade is the lowest for South Asia. The flow of ideas crudely measured by the cross-border movement of people, or the number of telephone calls, or the purchase of technology and royalty payments, are all low for South Asia. So, while South Asia has made significant progress in integrating with the global economy, integration within the region remains limited, primarily due to fears emanating from the varying size of economies. Sri Lanka can play a leading role in changing this. Both India and Sri Lanka are members of SAARC, the Indian subcontinent's equivalent of ASEAN, which offers tariff reductions between members. While this regional initiative has seen some progress, a lot more can be done. There are already powerful examples in Asia that show us that differences in size is no constraint to beneficial partnerships, if we use each country's strengths depending on the opportunities. As an island economy, Sri Lanka's regional connectivity has been mainly through its seaport in Colombo, a transshipment hub for South Asia. To expand capacity, the country must engage private investments in infrastructure by strengthening the country's institutional and regulatory environment. Active participation in SAARC, which I mentioned, the Bay of Bengal Initiative for Multi-Sectoral Technical and Economic Cooperation, called BIMSTEC, and the South Asia Sub-Regional Economic Cooperation Group, CESEC, can all help build further connectivity with neighboring countries and the rest of Asia. Moving on to foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment needs to be a high priority area for growth and employment. India has set an example in the neighborhood. With progressive FDI policies and an activist approach to inviting investment, India has become one of the largest destinations of foreign investment. When I served in the Obama administration, I also had oversight of a unit called Select USA, the federal government's investment promotion organization. A country as economically vigorous as the US still recognizes the value of foreign investment for job creation and advancing competitiveness. Sri Lanka's foreign investment has remained low, below 2% of GDP over the past 20 years. In addition, new FDI in the past few years has been predominantly infrastructure-oriented, with only a relatively small proportion reaching sectors that are associated with global value chains. Private sector investment has remained constrained because of the business environment has not been conducive, and the public sector has played a dominant role. Since the government's budgetary resources are limited, the private sector is expected to play a larger role in infrastructure development through PPPs, as we see in India. Policies to improve the investment climate, complemented by upgrades in the quality of infrastructure and human resources, need urgent attention to catalyze domestic investment and attract FDI. Breaking from the past, Sri Lanka's new Inland Revenue Act, approved in October 2017, aims for a transparent, unified, and even-handed legal framework. Consistent implementation of this new rule-based system could help unlock long-term investment decisions. More generally, it is vital to cut the red tape hampering businesses to attract greater FDI from various countries. KPMG India has worked extensively with the governments of various states in India in the area of investment promotion. Sri Lanka could adopt best practices from the various states in India, from their investment promotion boards, to restructure Sri Lanka's Board of Investment towards purely promoting FDI and away from regulating FDI and managing export processing zones. The work involved in promoting FDI has many dimensions. For example, in India, KPMG has undertaken extensive work with respect to development strategy. For example, again, in the ITES sector for the state of Uttar Pradesh, to articulate the IT policy of that state. We've done market potential studies to promote investment in the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. We've created a roadmap and helped develop a vision for infrastructure development in various sectors in the Punjab, and so on. Ease of doing business is increasingly a key diagnostic parameter for global investors today. In India, KPMG has been working actively with the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, as well as with many states, to help measure and improve the ease of doing business. India, as you would all know, made a remarkable improvement in its ease of doing business rankings this year by 30 places, moving up from 130 to 100. This jump was driven by improvement in many parameters, like construction permits, paying taxes, and insolvency resolution. Most importantly, it is the relentless implementation and on-ground results that made all the difference in India. Sri Lanka also is on a similar path, with the government having fast-tracked the progress of many business-friendly reforms with the aim of moving 20 notches up in the World Bank's ease of doing business for 2019 from the 111th slot that Sri Lanka occupies today. Along with ease of doing business, combating corruption and unfair market practices should be at the heart of the efforts of the government. To this end, Sri Lanka should have a strong national framework for public services complaints. There are many good examples to pick from. Indonesia, for example, has a public complaints unit called Lapor, which has turned out to be very effective. Let me now move to the fourth point, which is on infrastructure. Sri Lanka has been successful in developing basic infrastructure. It is the highest road density in South Asia. 98% of its population has access to electricity, 96% to safe water, and 95% to sanitation. But Sri Lanka ranks a relatively low 73 out of 138 countries for infrastructure development in the Global Competitive Index 2016-2017. Thus, given its aggressive ambitions, there is a requirement to further invest in growth-oriented infrastructure like energy, transport, and urban development. During the period 2018 to 2022, infrastructure investment needs are estimated to be $5 to $6 billion a year to attain the government's economic growth targets. The capacity of the government to increase infrastructure investments is currently constrained, of course, by a difficult fiscal situation. It is notable in this context that Sri Lanka is focused on this area with support from multilateral development banks like the ADB to improve road, port, and railway connectivity. Further, there's a dire need, as in India and many developing countries, to leapfrog over decades-old infrastructure and modernize the energy sector by investing in smart grids, efficient technologies, and mobile apps for electricity payments. Today, Asia invests $880 billion in infrastructure overall, which is barely half of what is needed. Over the next 15 years, this need is estimated to be 4 times the current investment. Adequate infrastructure is not only necessary for accelerating economic growth, but is also a prerequisite to achieve better health, education, and other development outcomes. Fiscal reforms to enhance sustainability of government finances and public infrastructure investments need to continue. There is also a requirement to create a governance mechanism to implement projects successfully. Legal frameworks, regulatory policies, and strengthening the overall policy environment is imperative. Engagement with private sector to boost efficiency of infrastructure services should also be explored. These reforms will ultimately enhance Sri Lanka's ability to address border and behind-the-border barriers for cross-border collaboration infrastructure, example, the harmonizing of regulatory standards. Staying on the topic of beyond-the-border connectivity, a free and open Indian Ocean is at the core of the emerging Indo-Pacific view of the world. The Indo-Pacific paradigm recognizes deepened connections between the Indian Ocean region and the Pacific, from the shores of Africa all the way to the west coast of the Americas. Sri Lanka is physically a veritable attractive diadem in this picture of the Indo-Pacific. Many countries, notably China, India, and Japan, are seeking a greater role in developing Sri Lanka's strategic location between the energy-rich Middle East, Africa, and the Straits of Malacca. The US, too, is not far from considering Sri Lanka as a strategic bulwark. Sri Lanka, no doubt, would want to make the best of its attractive location by fashioning itself as a potential trade and finance hub open to doing business with everyone, thus taking it closer to its economic vision. But, of course, it will be a delicate balancing game. Historically, Sri Lanka has had close relations with China, stretching for a couple of thousand years, and seeking to renew those connections would seem to be the natural thing to do. The recent expansion of China's economic and military reach has caught international interest, given China's principle of active defense and the history of acting in self-interest. Sri Lanka should, of course, be fully conscious of this. Access to an industrial park in Sri Lanka and the management of the Hambantota deep-sea port and the international airport are recent signs of China asserting itself at the international high table. It is also an indication of Chinese designs to build influence by creating logistics bases globally and alongside securing access to strategic resources. Port City Colombo, financed by China, promises to be a game changer for Sri Lanka, and the government hopes its development will help Colombo become an enhanced trading hub between Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The port will also be a finance center accessing the Indian subcontinent's rapidly developing markets, attracting overseas investors and increasing employment. Given that large economies in Asia, such as India and Japan, cannot fund Sri Lanka's large infrastructure needs fully, Sri Lanka has looked to cooperate more closely with China. But several times, this easy money which is offered comes with strings attached, which could be unsustainable debt, as has been in the news lately, decreased transparency, restrictions on market economics, and a loss of control over natural resources. Internationally, the Bridge and Road initiative, into the designs of which Sri Lanka falls, has been viewed with suspicion that the global investment and lending program amounts to a debt trap for vulnerable countries around the world, fueling corruption and autocratic behavior in struggling countries. It is important in this context for Sri Lanka to take a well-informed approach to also engage with the rest of the economies in the region, finalizing free trade agreements with many of the major regional powers over the next year or so would be desirable as balancing and enhancing measures. Among these are the economic and technology cooperative agreement with India and FTAs with other countries. The Sri Lankan government's turn towards broader engagement with East Asia recognizes the country's pivotal position as a strategic asset connecting with both India and China. Asia and the world will have a better future when the large economies work together, being sensitive to each other's interests. What would it take for Sri Lanka to be that Switzerland of Asia where the major countries work together? India is, of course, Sri Lanka's closest neighbor. The relations between the two countries is more than 2,500 years old, and both sides have built upon a legacy of intellectual, cultural, religious, and linguistic intercourse. In addition to the historical connections with India of Hinduism, of Buddhism, Sri Lanka also has had an ethnic Tamil diaspora that has deep linkages with Indian people in the state of Tamil Nadu. Many Indian origin diaspora have resided in its southern neighbor for decades now. They in fact form an important link between the Indian and Sri Lankan people and the government. But most importantly, as I mentioned, the dynamic economy in India today should be very, very attractive as a source of growth for Sri Lanka. By virtue of its proximity, India is a natural trading partner. Should the tiny island state need any assistance, India is close at hand. So India is well positioned both strategically and market-wise, and I would say most importantly market-wise, because as I said earlier, the market in India today is just booming. Both countries are democracies. The relations between both countries have matured and diversified with the passage of time, encompassing all areas of contemporary relevance and the extensive people-to-people interaction of their citizens. So the India-Sri Lanka relationship is multifaceted. Sri Lanka has gone through defining transitions over the past decade. Despite significant productivity growth in the post-war period, it has been challenging for Sri Lanka to diversify exports and get its share in global trade, which has been declining gradually. Unlike its East Asian neighbors, Sri Lanka's export structure has been static for years, reflecting a lack of competitive forces to drive trade dynamism, innovation, and diversification. When I interact with investors and trade delegations from around the world, overwhelmingly, Sri Lanka's geographic location and access to regional markets are cited as top reasons for their interest in the country's economy. Sitting in the middle of the Indian Ocean, off the southern tip of India, Sri Lanka occupies an enviable strategic position, a blessing that, with careful and thoughtful handling and long-term vision and a commitment to openness, can be leveraged to its advantage. Leveraging the island's geostrategic position can be a game changer for economic growth. Reforms to ease the business environment and trade, now at the early stages of implementation, can become catalysts and enablers for accelerated growth. Other countries that have pursued infrastructure scale-up have learned that business environment liberalization is also required for private sector-led growth. To this end, the current economic environment offers a window of opportunity for evaluating structural weaknesses and working towards enhancing competitiveness. Clearly, the Sri Lankan government is focused on making the country more open to the world and becoming an attractive place to do business. The key, as we have seen in India, is that the leadership should place relentless focus on execution. Sustained commitment and follow-through will be required to see that reforms succeed. Once again, I thank the members of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce for giving me this opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Deeply insightful and penetratingly perceptive. That keynote address came to you on a platform of a wealth of knowledge and information and experience from our keynote speaker, which we should be taking much advantage of in the next panel session. We would now be concluding our inauguration and moving on to session 1 immediately. I would like to invite Mr. Rajendra Tyagaraja, while saying thank you to him, to please step down while we invite our moderator, Shiran Fernando, Chief Economist of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, to continue this next session, our first session, technical session. I'd also like to welcome very warmly one of the panelists, who joined this session of this first session, the State Minister of Finance and Mass Media, the Honorable Eran Wickramaratne. A token of appreciation to Mr. Kumar for his very insightful keynote address.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first session at the Sri Lanka Economic Summit. Staying true to the theme of on the fast track to a turnaround, we are tackling that issue by first looking at a macro level. Where is the economy heading towards? And I think as elaborated by the chairman as well as our keynote speaker, and it's often said, we live in interesting times, and this period is no different. We're in the backdrop of beyond what's going on domestically, externally, we're seeing a lot of changes in terms of where interest rates are going. The global trade growth momentum, which was there from 2017, is seeing a bit of a blip. We're getting mixed signals in terms of where commodities are going. And all this is impacting Sri Lanka as it looks to push through some reforms through, get growth back on track, and make sure that prosperity is enjoyed by the masses. So I think we have with us a very eminent panel. And if generally we do have economists talking about on an economic turnaround, but we have 4 economists to be precise. We have an economist who is now a politician, Minister Eran. We have an economist who was previously a minister who is now with the IMF and is the IMF resident representative, Dr. Eteri. We have from an investment background who's here with us as well, Ms. Anubhuti Sahe from Standard Chartered Bank. And we have, to round off the economists, we have Dr. Nishan, who is part of a leading think tank, who's executive director of a leading think tank, Verite Research. And into that mix, we have the thoughts and ideas from our keynote speaker. And to round it off, we have the private sector view from a personality who is very well known in the corporate circles, Mr. Asoka Piris. So I think how we will go about this is Anubhuti will kickstart with her presentation for about 15 minutes, touching on the global dynamics and its relation to Sri Lanka. Dr. Eteri will pick it up from there and move into the local implications. And Minister Eran will then examine, I guess, both presentations, give his perspectives and the policy drive towards it. And then we'll start off with our panel discussion. I'd encourage you to download the app if you have not already. There are 2 things in particular to do. There are questions that you can ask in the Q&A session because we want to make it as interactive as possible. Less questions from me, more questions from you, the better. So download the app. The session which is happening now is session 1. You can go into that session, click on the questions, ask the speaker questions, ask your questions, and then there's also polls that are also going on, which will also add to the discussion and into the end presentation that we're hoping to make, as mentioned by the chairman. So Anubhuti, the floor is yours.
Very good morning to everyone. And in the next 15 minutes, I will be discussing few important global themes and what it means for Sri Lanka in specific and how Sri Lanka can navigate through it. As Shiran was mentioning, we live in interesting times. But when times are interesting, uncertainty is also very high. So we live in interesting as well as very uncertain times as changes around us unravel themselves in the most unexpected manner. And it's important to acknowledge that these changes, these uncertainties, and risks associated with these changes will persist for years, if not for decades. And therefore, every single economy, including Sri Lanka, will have to navigate through tough economic environment going forward. It is thus necessary that we assess what the risks are, what are the likely sources of risks, so that we can manage them very, very effectively in order to unlock the existing opportunities as well as to find new ones. So in that broader backdrop, I would like to flag 3 specific major shifts which are happening in the global economy as we speak, what it means for the economy, the global economy at large, and Sri Lanka in specific, and very briefly touch upon how Sri Lanka can navigate through these changes. So coming to the first major shift, that shift is related to a 2-dimensional change in the monetary policy of advanced economies. As we all very well know, that after global financial crisis, in order to support the growth story, in order to support the markets, major central banks pursued an excessively, or we can say an ultra-loose monetary policy. But now they are trying to normalize it by raising rates and by reducing liquidity in the overall global markets. In fact, if you look at the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of the United States, they have hiked rates by 150 basis points. I mean, their rates were very close to zero just 2 years back. They have raised rates by 150 basis points since 2016. And in our view, according to Standard Chartered, given the strong growth in US, though it comes on back of a sugar rush of fiscal stimulus, we think they are on a track to go and raise rates by 4 more times from here till mid of 2019. Not only are they raising rates, but they have actually started taking out liquidity from the global markets. The other major central bank, European Central Bank or ECB, is not hiking rates. We think they are still far away from hiking rates. Maybe it's more a story of second half of 2019 than 2018 itself, but they are on a well-telegraphed path to bring an end to their liquidity injection plan by end of 2018. I'm talking a lot about liquidity, why it is important, especially for emerging markets. I guess it becomes, the point becomes, becomes more prominent if we focus on this particular chart. Now, what the blue shaded area primarily reflects is the amount of liquidity injection which these major central banks, that is Federal Reserve, ECB, BOE, and BOJ, have done over past, since global financial crisis. And if you focus on this area, which is, 2016 and 2017, you can clearly see that these central banks, all these 4 major central banks, injected $2 trillion $2 trillion on an annual basis to keep market supported, to keep growth supported. It definitely helped, and emerging markets, developing economies, Sri Lanka, everyone benefited from the ample liquidity. But now these central banks, as they are pushing back, this liquidity injection has already halved in 2018 and will drop to zero. So if you look at this point, it will drop to zero in 2019. So the shift is massive, the magnitude is great, and it is inevitable that it will have a massive impact on interest rates across the world, not only in Sri Lanka, across the world. It will have massive impact on FX. Currencies are likely to stay under pressure, and there will be increased financial volatility. Higher oil prices are not helping much. What further complicates is the second big shift, which is to do with rising protectionism. I mean, to be fair, protectionism is not a new phenomenon. We have been seeing it across the world. It has been a story for past few years. But probably 2018 stands out because the escalation in trade tension between US and China took all of us by surprise. And it's inevitable that if these trade tensions actually culminate into a trade war, it will have massive impact on global economy. It's difficult to quantify it. I can't give you a number to say, okay, if we end up in a period of trade war, we will get so much of loss in global growth. But probably just to get some sense, we did some economic analysis, we did some econometric analysis, and looked at the extreme case where if US bans all import from China, US economic loss in our view would be close to 1% of GDP. I mean, it's not a small loss because US is a $19 trillion economy. For China, the loss is likely to be more than 3% of GDP. Again, it's not a small amount because China is close to $12 to $13 trillion economy. So we are talking about big numbers here. Difficult to give one big comprehensive number, but every single economy, US, China, here we have got a whole list of economies which are likely to lose in case of trade tensions, in case trade tensions actually escalate into a trade war, but losses will be massive. And I think if we look at the immediate part, if we are looking at 2018 and if we are looking at 2019, I think more than the impact on the real economy, because we think that real economy impact will come with much of a lag. The bigger round of risk is primarily going to come through financial markets, through loss of economic, through loss of confidence. And that will put further pressure on currencies and will create a lot more problems for policymakers in rest of the world. What does this all mean for economies like Sri Lanka? I mean, in this kind of an environment where risk aversion is massive, foreign money is very, very difficult to get. So economies, like say India, if I take the example of India, which run a twin deficit, you run a current account deficit, you run a fiscal deficit, you need foreign money to pay for your, say, import bill. These economies get hurt the most. And in that context, Sri Lanka actually is in a vulnerable position. It runs a current account deficit, it runs a fiscal deficit. So that makes it vulnerable, and that makes it important that more measures are taken in order to reduce the vulnerability on this account. Not to miss out, more than 50% of fiscal deficit is nowadays getting financed through foreign inflows. And if the environment globally remains tough, this funding can come at a very, very expensive price. There is a huge amount of debt redemptions bunched up between 2018 and 2022. Sri Lanka imports huge amount of its fuel from the rest of the world. So putting it all together, there are various points of vulnerabilities. And while I would not like to get into the numbers, but all these factors, I mean, if Sri Lankan rupee depreciates by, say, 5%, or if, say, crude oil prices increase by $10, it will mean that inflation will move higher, fiscal deficit and current account deficit will turn much wider and growth can suffer. So it's likely to be a tough environment going forward on back of these vulnerabilities. Touching on the third big shift, which is happening in the global economy, is about productivity gains. It might not seem very relevant in the immediate context, but as policy makers, one has to think not only about today, but for decades to come. In the first chart, what we show is that since global financial crisis, productivity growth has slowed down dramatically. Now, why productivity matters? It's an economist term, we talk a lot about it. It matters because slower productivity gains constrain growth. It has the potential to stagnate living standards. It has the potential to create social fissures and therefore, lead us to political pressures. We are not unfamiliar with this kind of a scenario. Look around the world, especially look in the developed economies, and we have seen what voters have gone for if inequalities increase and growth doesn't happen. So this is one area where policymakers, not only in Sri Lanka, but across the world, have to take care of, not from today's perspective, but for next few decades to come through. How Sri Lanka fares in this particular aspect? I would say Sri Lanka, especially in the South Asian context, is fair, it's definitely in a much more insulated space. The human development indicators are far better, and probably where even, countries like India would really aspire to reach at that particular point. The per capita income is high, inequality levels are low. So to that extent, it helps. But if we look at the change in competitiveness over the past few years, there are reasons to stay concerned. We did an interesting analysis. What we did was we looked at Global Competitiveness Index, which ranks a lot of economies. And we focused especially on the Asian economies, and what we observed that between 2008 and 2017-18, the economy in Asia which lost maximum number of ranks was Sri Lanka. Because of the slower pace of reforms, it lost on most of the pillars, and therefore there is a need to do a lot more catch-up because it was in a far better position a decade back. So in a nutshell, a lot of risks lingering in the global horizon, which will have implications for Sri Lanka and will complicate policy choices. So, but the good news is that the government has already initiated the corrective measures under, of course, with the support of multi-international organizations like IMF. And its efforts towards enhancing or moving towards narrower fiscal deficit by enhancing revenues and not by cutting expenditure is definitely noteworthy. Recent measures to link fuel prices to market prices is another important point. And we think more measures which finally make CBSL an inflation targeting central bank by 2020 can be other key milestones. But as the first speaker mentioned, a lot more needs to be done. And again, nothing very specific to Sri Lanka. Macro stability and sustaining growth is always an ongoing process. And that is something which Sri Lanka will have to go and do, not only for this year, but for many more years to come ahead. Our keynote speaker spoke at length about what Sri Lanka needs to do, and therefore I will not get into those details, but probably just, club them as a three-pronged approach. Sri Lanka needs to diversify, whether it is a diversification away from public sector-led growth to private sector-led growth, whether it is diversification of exports destination, export basket, or for that matter, even bringing in more female laborers in the labor force rather, in order to gain more productivity gains. The second thing which Sri Lanka should focus on, or should be the policy approach, is to leverage on its own strength. Sri Lanka has an enviable ranking when it comes to human development indicators. It needs to leverage on its educated and healthy workforce, needs to build in more business outsourcing units. It's surprising to me when I get to hear that a lot of companies across the world are actually opening up back office operations or business processing operations in countries as far as Poland. Sri Lanka, in my view, should be the top choice there. Even when it comes, given its educated force, when it comes to high-level R&D, Sri Lanka definitely offers a massive opportunity there. The third part is to do with streamline and stabilize. Bureaucracy, simplifying the legal framework, providing a more conducive environment for private sector to grow, linking the various parts of the economy are crucial to attain macro stability and to realize the potential of the economy. To conclude, I would say that reforms, if you look around the history, reforms in most of the countries have never taken in good times. They are always taken in the most difficult times. And probably that gives me a lot of hope, not only for Sri Lanka, but for a lot of countries, including India, that things will move in the right direction, because now we are not left with too many choices, or because now we are not spoiled with choices. So thanks a lot, and now I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
Thank you, Anubhuti, for those insightful remarks. I think she left us with three main areas in terms of diversification, leveraging, and also then went on to highlight what we need to do in terms of identifying reforms, and this stage in terms of the turnaround, looking at the risk in terms of opportunity. So with that, we'll move now to our second speaker, Dr. Ateri. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you, previous speakers, for a very interesting overview of global challenges as some of the reform priorities that Sri Lanka could take upon itself. In my presentation, I'm going to briefly talk about some of the regional context, and then I'll move into Sri Lanka-specific reform priorities. Good news is that Asia is still fastest growing region of the world, and the global growth contribution of Asia remains the highest. But as previous speaker said, world is becoming increasingly uncertain place with many risks playing at the same time. Asia remains fastest growing region, but Asia is aging, productivity is slowing, inequality is increasing, and trade wars threaten economic gains from past decades. We had also recent episodes of capital outflows in emerging markets, which led many Asian currencies to depreciate. I think one important aspect in terms of structural context to keep in mind is also that Asia is aging fast, and actually its fastest growing regions are aging at a higher speed than other countries. Asia is at risk of getting old before it actually gets rich. And if we look at Sri Lanka, in its aging profile, Sri Lanka is closer to East Asian neighbors, but in terms of development gains and growth potential reached, there is a lot of steps that Sri Lanka needs to take. Why aging is important? Because as economies age, it puts additional drag on the productivity, so effectively you have to do more dramatic reforms to be able to gain higher growth potential. Second structural issue I want to highlight, which previous speakers also spoke at length, is impact of trade on the growth potential. And as you could see on these two charts, Asia became highly integrated in global trade in past 2 decades, and gains from trade were substantial. Any escalation of trade tensions obviously threatens these trade linkages and supply chains, which may have negative implications for growth. And all this is happening in the context of US normalization and tightening conditions, which affect capital outflows from emerging markets, and expectations, as previous speakers were saying, are with higher funding costs and weaker currencies in Asia. In this challenging global environment, countries which have twin deficits, like Sri Lanka, are most vulnerable. So Sri Lanka has high debt and low revenues, and as past episodes of worsening global environment showed, if Sri Lanka continues on the path of fiscal consolidation and maintains consistently and persistently reform efforts which were underway in past couple of years, investor confidence could actually strengthen and remain with Sri Lanka. Second aspect of vulnerability for Sri Lanka is obviously current account deficit, low reserve position, high debt rollover requirements, and to manage those vulnerabilities, obviously Sri Lanka needs to maintain adequate reserve cover and strengthen its reserve position further, and has to deal with external shocks with more exchange rate flexibility. In that context, developing comprehensive inflation targeting framework and moving forward with that reform effort is essential. So let me briefly talk about extended fund facility supported program of government reforms. Extended fund facility was approved in 2016. It's a 3-year program in amount of 1.5 billion. 1 billion has been already disbursed. Program has been performing relatively well, and at this moment, 5th review is being conducted, and 1 more review remains to complete the program. EFF's objective is to support government's own reform priorities, which aim to grow country's own resources to meet its own social and development needs. Sri Lanka's key vulnerabilities, as said, are low revenue, high debt, and low reserve position. Introducing a new broad-based tax system and doing gradual fiscal consolidation, which will be revenue-based, will help to reduce and manage overall debt levels. This has to be supported with inflation targeting framework, with stronger reserve management and flexible exchange rate, and also transparent and accountability reforms, which should strengthen economic governance. All these reforms are going to outlive any kind of IMF support program and should lay the foundation for more predictable and stable macroeconomic management framework going forward. To mention also aspects of inclusiveness and more kind of broad-based development. Obviously, all these gains from revenues or external resources need to be channeled to more productive and inclusive economic activities. In that sense, we see potential to address issues like natural disaster mitigation and management, more active female labor force participation, and obviously protecting the most vulnerable for better targeted for better targeting social benefits. The most important aspects that which needs to be tackled to unlock Sri Lanka's growth potential is obviously competitiveness. And previous speakers spoke at length about the need to reduce regulatory burden, gradually open up for trade, and compete globally, compete regionally, move fast in that area because gains are quite large. As also indicating, while implementing various structural reforms, obviously macro stability is a key foundation, and those reforms have to continue. Inflation targeting framework has to continue, aimed at gradually reducing inflation, enabling flexible exchange rate regime, improving countries' external reserve cover. Central government fiscal consolidation, revenue-based fiscal consolidation has to also continue to gradually reduce the debt burden. To highlight some of the reforms which country has already implemented, I put up this list just for general reference. Many reforms are underway. Important steps have been taken to putting tax system on more stable and broad-based system to enable future revenue generation capacity. In that sense, reforms in Inland Revenue Act, VAT were essential. Now all the focus is about implementation through automated and predictable systems. In terms of public financial management, fiscal rule-based consolidation frameworks, predictable public financial management systems are the key, and addressing large state-owned enterprises and managing their debt profiles is also extremely important. In that sense, energy pricing reforms are key parameters. It's a necessary step to be able to contain fiscal costs from state-owned enterprises, but obviously it's not sufficient. More reforms need to be done to actually address cost efficiency of the state-owned enterprises from inside. Finally, let me briefly touch on competitiveness. As keynote speaker said, Sri Lanka, compared to other emerging markets, has a more restrictive FDI and trade regulatory environment, and there are huge gains to be made if this environment is more open and less regulated or more predictable. Sri Lanka's economy lost its trade competitiveness, and actually, as also mentioned here, its trade structure has not changed in past 25 years. It has remained garments and tea and rubber products, while, for example, East Asian neighbors have moved very fast on export diversification and export value chain. Now, question is why Sri Lanka's export structure has been frozen for past 25 years, and answer is because it's highly protected, highly regulated, and there is no space for competition and innovation. So to enable competition and innovation, you have to have less restrictive and more enabling regulatory environment. Final comment I want to make, there is a saying, if you don't know where you are going, you will always get there. I think Sri Lanka knows where it's going. It has set out very ambitious objectives to position itself as a regional and global hub for trade and development and innovation. It also knows how to get there. I think all the reforms mentioned here have been discussed many times, strategies have been developed, steps have been made to implement those strategies. And when, it depends. It depends how consistently and persistently those reforms are implemented, and it's function of effort that government as well as private sector, civil society of this country puts into this implementation. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Terry. Before the Honorable Minister delivers his speech and presentation, let me just remind you once again about the app. Please download it if you have not already. Go to session 1 and where you can click on Ask the Speaker and put your questions in. We have a couple at the moment, but keep them coming in so that we can have a very interactive session with the panelists. Minister Iran, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. We have been fortunate to listen to Arun Kumar's very incisive analysis and also Anubhuti's managing the risk that exists in the environment. And then, of course, what Terry said, because we have been in constant discussion. And I'm going to basically take some of those themes and maybe respond to the themes as well as say what's happening and not happening. I would say, by and large, I agree with particularly the risk analysis that was made this morning. Often we have an idea that somehow or other that government is God, and somehow or other government can solve all of our problems, including our economic problems. And I think that it was very clear from today's presentations that the risk environment is global, it's regional, and that Sri Lanka is a small economy within that. And so there are things that we can do and we must do, and then there are other vulnerabilities which we need to be aware of. I was also interested in the risk management presentation. It said, we need to look at managing risk, and some of these risks will be there over a longer period or even over a decade. Now, those of us who come from the private sector are basically looking at the next quarter. That's the problem we fundamentally face. So there are great risks. We talked about global major central banks, the curtailing of credit. And if you look at some of the measures that we have taken since 2015 in terms of reform, one of the casualties of that has been the growth rate because of the other fiscal disciplines that have been put in place. They talked about the China-US trade tension, and what it could do, and also Sri Lanka being more vulnerable in a sense because of the twin deficits that the country faced. In 2015, the budget deficit as a percentage of GDP was in excess of 7, and we've got it to 5.5, and we are hoping that it will go below 5 in 2018. We would not divert from that path of fiscal consolidation because we think that we need to look at the vulnerabilities and take a much more long-term perspective. Now, somebody said, and I don't know whether it was Anubhuti in her presentation, policymakers have to think about the decades to come. Politicians think about the next election. And this is the, if you want, the conflict that we face, and this is the conflict that we are facing immediately. This is the conflict that the Finance Minister, Mangala Samaravira, will be grappling with over the next few weeks. Sri Lanka has, over time, unfortunately, made the wrong decision over decades. That's why we started at the same line, and then you have countries like Singapore where they are today, and you have countries like Sri Lanka where they are today. It's because of this conflict, and it's not a new conflict, it's a conflict that has existed over a long time. There are two exogenous factors that generally impact us greatly. One is the weather, and the other is the fuel prices, both of over which we don't have too much control. As you know, in 2017, weather impacted us. Maybe about 20 districts of our 25 districts had a drought, and then that impact was one of the reasons that we deviated somewhat from our fiscal consolidation because of that exogenous factor. And in the presentation now, also there were numbers quoted and said, if fuel prices go by X, what will actually happen, right, to our current account, what will actually happen in terms of the inflationary impact. I must say that given the reforms that we have undertaken, right, we have in 2017, the macroeconomic indicators were doing better. I think everybody will agree the trade deficit, the deficit, budget deficit is at least trending down. We'll agree that inflation has been trending down. Reserves have been up, exports have been up, and these are good indicators. But these are small numbers, and in a larger global context and in a larger global economy, the vulnerabilities do exist. Eteri talked about some of the reforms that have been undertaken, and she mentioned, for example, the fuel price reforms that have been undertaken, which was a major step for us because some people say, you know, the government is indecisive, you take one step forward and then one step back. It's a nature of a coalition government. You see, that sometimes, unlike a single party government with a single mandate, which is able to take a unilateral decision, coalition governments by their nature sometimes has a revisitation. And the revisitation comes because of lobbies that basically go up and then question it, and then one party in there says, okay, we need to relook at it. This is not acceptable, but this is what actually happens. And I often tell people that you are looking at me and saying, why is it happening? You are to blame. And I turn around and tell them, you are to blame, because that's a mandate you gave us. And we are acting within the mandate that has been given. It's a coalition mandate that actually has been given. Now this situation, the reason I'm saying this is, this situation can continue in the future too. This situation can continue. You look at countries across Europe, there has been a shift. Increasingly, there are coalition governments all over the world because democracies are exercising itself in particular ways. So this is, you know, one of the reasons. Fuel prices, energy reforms, and even, you know, things like water. Now, some of these topics are very sensitive because sometimes people take these things out of context and then they create a negative impression about the country. And that's why I want to say what I'm saying as clearly as possible, because sometimes people take things out of context and they quote these things. Recently, I made a comment about the exchange rate, and I saw the Reuters reporter had misinterpreted my comments on the exchange rate management and misled the public as a result of it. In my comment, what I meant was the fact that the Ministry of Finance would not intervene in exchange rate management. It's a departure from the past. We believe in an independent central bank. We have given the central bank the space, unlike in the past, right? But that was misreported. And it is independently done by the central bank. I understand that the central bank would intervene as and when necessary to curb excessive volatility in the exchange rate. Central bank had made a statement about it. Now, I would go further and hope that not only that, the central bank will actually punish speculators. So I think that comments sometimes are taken out of context and misrepresented. I was also disturbed to see Nomura analysts having misquoted Sri Lanka and putting it on a very high vulnerability scale. And they had said that Sri Lanka's short-term external debt is $160 billion. I don't know where on earth they got such a figure. Even our GDP is not that. And I mean, very unfortunate, erroneous reporting, when I think that figure is probably somewhere around $10 billion and quoting it as $160 billion. So the reason I said this is, when you talk openly and frankly about sensitive issues, people sometimes, if you are misquoted, unfortunately it can have a negative impact. This is our economy, this is our country, and as Eteri said, we think we know where it's going, and we will make sure that it goes in that direction. I was in Monaragala just about 10 days ago, and I visited some of the poorest villages in this country, the poorest villages. Monaragala is the second poorest district in the country. And I was there, I visited the local temples, even the temples were poor. The economy is poor. And I asked them, what is the requirement? And they basically said, we need water. They wanted basically their local tanks, and I went to 3 villages, basically their local tanks rehabilitated. And we agreed to do that. In fact, we agreed, we took immediate steps in rehabilitating it. We have a program that's going on. We are rehabilitating 1,200 tanks across the country. Unfortunately, Sri Lanka is a country, we are facing the impacts of global warming, though we are not responsible for it. We are one of the probably 10 most vulnerable countries in terms of environmental disasters, and that's what we are doing. But then, as I opened the shower this morning and I got under the shower, and I was having my very comfortable shower, I was looking at the water that was actually being expended. As you brush your teeth and you open your tap, the water that is being expended. And when you look at it, you pick the bottle of water, and I came in here and I was so happy to see that there were no bottles of water, but that the water was actually, you know, in glass, whatever, you know, vases. So I was happy to see that, but if you really examine, and yesterday I was at a seminar, I took the bottle of water and I realized that the bottle of water was more expensive than the kerosene that was being given, and a little under the price of diesel that was being given. In 100 years, our forest cover has come down, and this expense has gone on. But the reason I raised it here when we talk about reform, right? But if you talk about reform in water, I think that those of us who are misusing it should be paying for it, so that those villages in Monoragala are actually subsidized by those taxes that we take. So when you're looking at reform, there are lots of sensitive issues that we need to look at, but you know, politicians, we don't want to even talk about them because they are so sensitive, and we don't have a decade, we just have a few months before the next election. So the other major reform issue is really protection versus competition. You see, and this is a highly contentious issue. I'm in a private sector audience. Most people who come to see us generally want their industries protected. But where do we want Sri Lanka to really be? Our exporters, some of them have done extremely well. Our rubber tires are used in the world's top aircrafts. Our surgical gloves are used by the world's best surgeons. Our electronic sensors are used in the world's top car brands. Our apparels are worn by the world's top athletes, and also we are producing some of the world's top brands. Our IT software is used in the world's leading stock markets. So we can compete, we must compete. And I think the issue, I think Eteri's last slide that she brought up, the issue of competition came up strongly. There is no other way for this country unless we open up and unless we basically are ready to compete. Because our 21 million market won't make a huge difference to raise our living standards. We have to access the larger market, and we have to be the gateway to the South Asian market. We have undertaken tax reforms. I won't go into the details, but we will be removing para-tariffs over the next period, right? And I know that that will mean competition for lots of us here, from the airport development levy to the cessors, right? We are going in that direction. We are, as the presenters showed and talked about, including the keynote speaker today, the Inland Revenue Bill, despite all its hiccups in implementation, and I admit that there are hiccups in implementation, it's certainly moving Sri Lanka to a more rules-based system, taking discretion away from politicians and from bureaucrats. The increasing, the ease of doing business, much to be done. I accept the criticisms that were made today. Much needs to be done. We have a single window that we have basically created to facilitate online systems of some regulatory agencies. So far, we have got the National Plant Quarantine Service, the System of Department of Animal Production and Health, and the Sri Lanka Standards Institute on it. So we've got all that in one place. And we have also got a trade portal going. I think this is all ongoing work, still not completed. But I think it's worthwhile mentioning these things because these are all moving in the right direction. You see, in terms of a web-based portal, it make all cross-border trade regulatory information available. And I can see lots of things: laws, prohibitions, restrictions, technical standards, commodity classifications, tariffs, license, permits, applications, clearances, everything coming. And as this came in, the one thing that surprised me of how many are there. I mean, that's the problem. You see, we take existing things and we generally digitize them, but that really won't solve the problem. We had 788 of these. We were only second to Vietnam, which had about 1,500. But then Vietnam is not our benchmark on these. So we have much to be done, but the reason I mentioned it is at least we are going in the right direction, right? So then we have to, I would also quickly want to mention that about the free trade agreements. I know free trade agreements are not going to immediately increase your exports, but it is going in the direction of reform. You know that we have the Indo-Lanka Free Trade Agreement, 10 rounds of discussions have been held, more than 4,000 product lines are now duty-free into India. We have gained from the original Indo-Lanka Free Trade Agreement more than India has, because they keep exporting outside the agreement, whether we had the agreement or not. We have been increasing our exports all the time. There's so much misinformation about these, or the bad experience of a few people sometimes overshadow the larger picture for the country. And therefore, EDCA is going to be actually expanding the scope. The biggest scope that we expanded was in our Singapore Free Trade Agreement, where we went into services, investment, and economic cooperation. It's also a strategic move to look east. Our traditional markets in the US and Europe, but we have to begin to look east. While we also take the point that Arun made, more integration with South Asia. I don't have time, so I won't get into all those details, but maybe I'll just close there and we'll go into the discussion, and maybe I can clarify more. Thank you again for inviting me to be here this morning.
Thank you, Minister Ron. I think we got frank sort of replies to some of the queries and also some of the views in terms of the other issues as well. For the two panelists, I think how we'll do is I'll maybe do an initial 2 rounds of questions to the panelists, and then see a lot of questions coming in through the app, so keep them coming, and let me curate it and ask them with the panelists as well. To the two panelists who have not spoken as yet, I think Asoka and Dr. Nishan, I think we are hearing, in terms of some of the macro indicators, a more stable economy in terms of some of the numbers. But we're also seeing it in the backdrop of these external risks as described in the presentations. We're seeing corporate earnings, though concerns are there, still growing, if you look at it from a quarter-on-quarter basis or in terms of a year on, the 12 months preceding it. But we're seeing private sector sentiment declining. If you look at various indicators, it's showing a decline. Sentiment overall is negative. What is the why are we seeing this divergence, do you think? And is it part of this economic turnaround, or are we in that stage where it's at the bottom and we're rising up, or at what point of this cycle are we at?
Thank you, Chair.
In this age of constant technology disruptions, the importance of ICT to organizational governance is now in the spotlight more than ever before. BoardPack, the award-winning multinational paperless board meeting automation solutions provider, has been at the helm of governing boards across 20,000 plus users in over 20 countries. BoardPack, the #1 experiential board meeting automation solutions provider.
Strategically located along the 21st century maritime Silk Road, Sri Lanka, the pearl of the Indian Ocean, the key link between the East and the West, offers access to a thriving region poised for accelerated growth. Rising from the seas of Sri Lanka, Port City Colombo is a large-scale reclamation and city development project. Undertaken jointly by China Communications Construction Company, a Fortune 500 company, and the government of Sri Lanka. Spanning 269 hectares, Port City Colombo, when fully developed, will have a total gross floor area of more than 5.65 million square meters. A modern city where people can work, live, and play. The government of Sri Lanka is actively working on turning this into an international financial city, with new commercial legislation modeled after British laws, coupled with preferential tax, custom, immigration regulations, and other attractive policies. Port City Colombo will attract top multinational corporations and global talent. A state-of-the-art convention and exhibition center capable of hosting large-scale international events will position Port City Colombo as a new hub for business and MICE activities in the region. Port City Colombo will also be the pioneer of the smart city concept in Sri Lanka, where IT expertise using cloud computing and the latest cutting-edge technology creates a seamless living environment, making smart living, smart working, and smart estate management a reality. Port City Colombo has adopted the latest sustainable city concepts, with emphasis on a people-friendly environment using the transit-oriented developments concept to minimize commuting, further enhances the project's sustainability. Port City Colombo will be the most livable city and desired travel destination in the South Asian region, with a 2-kilometer sandy beach, a water channel that flows through the middle of the city, a central park with lush greenery and park connectors traversing across its length and breadth, with the best of healthcare and education. Port City Colombo will be amongst the very best top international cities, world-class hospitality, integrated resort and theme park, a retail destination that is home to the best of international brands and local retailers. A luxury marina will make Port City Colombo a top tourist destination. Building a world-class city for South Asia. Port City Colombo.
For 50 long years, a blossoming conglomerate has been on a journey of responsible entrepreneurship, enriching lives, empowering those who are less fortunate, giving impetus to the nation's growth by catalyzing critical industries and being an exemplary corporate citizen. Within a span of 50 years, Sunshine Holdings has transformed and reached the pinnacle of many industries. Today, Sunshine Holdings is the #1 tea producer and #1 palm oil producer, the #1 branded tea marketer, which shapes the guest experience in over 100 luxury hotels in 23 countries, the #1 health and wellness retailer, serving 1.3 million customers annually, and the second largest private healthcare marketing company. Sunshine Holdings continues its journey of responsible entrepreneurship, giving fresh impetus to the nation's growth.
small, sometimes it's easy to be overlooked. And that's not good enough. So we get behind all businesses, big and small. Because we're not here for good enough. We're here for good.
In this age of constant technology disruptions, the importance of ICT to organizational governance is now in the spotlight more than ever before. BoardPack, the award-winning multinational paperless board meeting automation solutions provider, has been at the helm of governing boards across 20,000 plus users in over 20 countries. BoardPack, the #1 experiential board meeting automation solutions provider.
Strategically located along the 21st century maritime Silk Road, Sri Lanka, the pearl of the Indian Ocean, the key link between the East and the West, offers access to a thriving region poised for accelerated growth. Rising from the seas of Sri Lanka, Port City Colombo is a large-scale reclamation and city development project. Undertaken jointly by China Communications Construction Company, a Fortune 500 company, and the government of Sri Lanka. Spanning 269 hectares, Port City Colombo, when fully developed, will have a total gross floor area of more than 5.65 million square meters. A modern city where people can work, live, and play. The government of Sri Lanka is actively working on turning this into an international financial city, with new commercial legislation modeled after British laws, coupled with preferential tax, custom, immigration regulations, and other attractive policies. Port City Colombo will attract top multinational corporations and global talent. A state-of-the-art convention and exhibition center capable of hosting large-scale international events will position Port City Colombo as the new hub for business and MICE activities in the region. Port City Colombo will also be the pioneer of the smart city concept in Sri Lanka, where IT expertise using cloud computing and the latest cutting-edge technology creates a seamless living environment, making smart living, smart working, and smart estate management a reality. Port City Colombo has adopted the latest sustainable city concepts, with emphasis on a people-friendly environment using the transit-oriented developments concept to minimize commuting, further enhances the project's sustainability. Port City Colombo will be the most livable city and desired travel destination in the South Asian region, with a 2-kilometer sandy beach, a water channel that flows through the middle of the city, a central park with lush greenery and park connectors traversing across its length and breadth, with the best of healthcare and education. Port City Colombo will be amongst the very best top international cities. World-class hospitality, integrated resort and theme park, a retail destination that is home to the best of international brands and local retailers, a luxury marina will make Port City Colombo a top tourist destination. Building a world-class city for South Asia. Port City Colombo.
For 50 long years, a blossoming conglomerate has been on a journey of responsible entrepreneurship, enriching lives, empowering those who are less fortunate, giving impetus to the nation's growth by catalyzing critical industries and being an exemplary corporate citizen. Within a span of 50 years, Sunshine Holdings has transformed and reached the pinnacle of many industries. Today, Sunshine Holdings is the #1 tea producer and #1 palm oil producer, the #1 branded tea marketer, which shapes the guest experience in over 100 luxury hotels in 23 countries, the #1 health and wellness retailer, serving 1.3 million customers annually, and the second largest private healthcare marketing company. Sunshine Holdings continues its journey of responsible entrepreneurship, giving fresh impetus to the nation's growth.
When you're small, sometimes it's easy to be overlooked. And that's not good enough. So we get behind all businesses, big and small. Because we're not here for good enough. We're here for good.
In this age of constant technology disruptions, the importance of ICT to organizational governance is now in the spotlight more than ever before. BoardPack, the award-winning multinational paperless board meeting automation solutions provider, has been at the helm of governing boards across 20,000 plus users in over 20 countries. BoardPack, the #1 experiential board meeting automation solutions provider.
Strategically located along the 21st century maritime Silk Road, Sri Lanka, the pearl of the Indian Ocean, the key link between the East and the West, offers access to a thriving region poised for accelerated growth. Rising from the seas of Sri Lanka, Port City Colombo is a large-scale reclamation and city development project. Undertaken jointly by China Communications Construction Company, a Fortune 500 company, and the government of Sri Lanka. Spanning 269 hectares, Port City Colombo, when fully developed, will have a total gross floor area of more than 5.65 million square meters. A modern city where people can work, live, and
Good morning, and if you can all take your seats, please, we can get this session underway on time. Can we all take our seats, please? Okay. Good morning and welcome to the session, the last session before lunch, which is the topic is turnaround, shifting gear from slow to fast track. And to deliver the keynote, we have the Honorable Dr. Harsha De Silva, the State Minister of National Policies and Economic Affairs. I think most suitable to speak on this topic. Thank you, Harsha, for being here. And I also would like to welcome the panelists, Captain Ravindra Jayavikrama, Chief Executive Officer of the Hambantota International Port Services, Dr. Liang Tao Ming, Chief Sales and Marketing Officer of CHTC Port City Colombo. We also have Mr. Jeevan Nyanam, who is the Director, Orion City, and co-founder of Hatch, Chairman Slascom. We have Shalin Balasuriya, who is the Director and co-founder, Ceylon Luxury Ayurveda Spa. And last but not least, the lady in the panel, Ms. Shivani Hegde, Managing Director, CEO of Nestle Lanka Private Limited. So without any further ado, may I invite you, Harsha, to deliver your keynote. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Jim. You are all good. It's really a privilege to stand in front of you, usually critical. Try to see whether I can convince you otherwise. I'll give you the summary. The problem, the way I see it, of the growth that is stuck, why we can't speed up our growth is because we are not increasing exports to cover the increase in imports as growth accelerates. So in a very simplified way, that is the problem. I see Arun, I don't know what his keynote was, but I'm sure he did mention these things. Because that really is the problem that we need to resolve. Before coming to the Economic Affairs Ministry, was in the Foreign Ministry. And when I led delegations to Geneva and to Brussels to fight for GSP+, I realized that if we failed, the growth story would really not be one that we are trying to increase, but a growth story that probably was not going to exist. The post-war growth, how do I? Story of Sri Lanka, you see, has been quite rapid. But the issue is that acceleration was not sustainable. It was pretty much non-tradable growth. If you see the increase in the construction sector, you see how rapidly it expanded. And if you look at the manufacturing activities, you'll see it not very significant at all. However, if you look at the period after that, 14 to 16, you still see mainly non-tradable growth, which is not the solution to the problem that I described at the beginning. Of course, we see IT that's really showing some significant growth, which is very positive, but certainly not sufficient. If you look at the exports, you know, without comparing with anyone else, it looks pretty decent.
Says, well, why are you saying that export growth hasn't been good enough? Look at this graph. You know, it's really climbing. But we have to compare ourselves. Where is that mountain that we saw earlier? You can't even see it. We're almost insignificant, because even though we grew to about $11 billion in exports, how does that compare with those countries that we compete? I'm just taking two countries here, Thailand and Vietnam, who's exporting $250 million plus. Now, if you look at the numbers, which I love to look at, our trade share dropped over time. However much people say, look, you know, the economy is expanding, unless you are able to get the trade to GDP ratio to something significant, we are going to lose the battle. So if we are falling from trade to GDP 88% to 53% today, exports to GDP ratio from almost 35% to 13%, and the global share, our share in the global exports from 0.08 to 0.05, you know certainly that something is wrong. You got to turn this around. It is not possible to carry on this way and expect to meet the targets that we have set for ourselves as a nation. We need a turnaround. We have no choice. We have to change the way we do business. We can learn from our competitor countries. Yeah, it's good. We can see what they have done. But also, we can learn from ourselves. You know, if you look at the ancient history of this country, Ptolemy described Sri Lanka, then Taprobane, as an island nearly of continental size. But we all know it was not of continental size. But the testimonial to the perception held by ancient travelers and merchants is because we were an important cog in trade at that time. And we don't need to go back 2,000 years. You know, we have this folk song, Parakum Yugak, Navata Tarambau, Nija Bhumita Le Lanka. What do we mean by that? Is it only the Parakrama Samudra that Parakrama Bahu built? Or is it something else? Of course, we all know about the Parakrama Samudra and what he did with agriculture. But he created a total export hub here. I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to read the great Parakrama Bahu's reign from about 1153 to 1180 or something like that. I want to read a couple of paragraphs. You know, the Chulavansa was written in the 13th century, and Parakrama Bahu was king in the 12th century. So we believe, historians believe, there's a whole lot of accuracy in what is in this book. Unrestricted exports of elephants from Burma to foreign countries had always been allowed, and there were many merchants in Burma engaged in the trade. King Aluang Situ, however, made the trade in elephants a royal monopoly and dramatically increased the price to be paid for them. He also discontinued the practice of presenting elephants to Sri Lankan ships. So he created a bit of a distortion in the free market of trade in elephants. And what happened after that? And I'm reading from the translation and also something that was written by Vijayawardena quoting KMD Silva and others. According to Chulavansa, Lanka had been buying Burmese elephants for 30 silver coins per elephant, and the king of Burma had, without pre-announcement, stopped selling elephants to Lankan shippers. When he finally permitted the sale of elephants to Lanka, the price had been raised from about 1,000 to 3,000 silver coins, making it completely prohibitive. Annoyed by these unilateral restrictions to trade, King Parakram Bahu invaded Burma to re-establish trade links with that country. So I'm just reading off this to reiterate the fact that in the days where this country was prosperous, we were prosperous because we were engaged in global trade. Historians show that coins from China to Persia to Egypt to Greece were all found in the period of Parakrama Bahu in Sri Lanka. The story is, in fact, he started with the alcohol trade. I don't have time to go into that now. But Chulavansa says that he brought alcohol and he wanted to make sure that he had the monopoly to sell alcohol and also to make sure people were not too drunk. Of course, you don't have to be stuck in the 12th century. Thereon, afterwards, we know how Sri Lanka moved during the colonial period also to becoming a export nation. But the traditional exports that we still continue to talk about is not going to help us win this battle or to achieve the turnaround that we require. We need diversification and complexity. I'm going to show you a few slides, and these slides I borrowed from Harvard CID, Atlas of Economic Complexity. What I want you to take a look at are the colors: coffee, tea, cocoa, crude rubber. That was our diversification in 1965. If you look at the diversification in 1990, we brought in apparels, of course, tea, spices, they all are still there. Look at 2015, apparels have sort of become quite big, but still tea, spices, rubber, all those traditional and low complex products. Now compare that with a country like Thailand, how their export diversification happened from 65 to 90. You see, the blue is important because they are manufactured items. The light blue is even more important because it's electronics and IT. And look at what happens in 2015. The original exports have almost become insignificant, and the blues have taken over. Electronics, office equipment, transport items, and so on. Vietnam, another country that's doing extremely well. And look at how the transformation has happened. In 90, they had hardly any blues, but look at 2015. It's all about electronics and higher value-added products. So if you look at all three countries, what you see is that over time, those competitor countries, they shifted from where they were to a pretty comfortable position now to take on the challenges in the future. I want you to take a look at this slide which I again borrowed from Harvard CID. What does it show? It shows the composition of new products in our export basket. Red, pink are new ones, meaning first year it showed up in the global atlas of merchandise trade. Red is it first showed up in 2000, pink is it first showed up in 1990. So these countries on your right have a lot of red and pink in them. What does it mean? It means they have moved on from traditional products to new products. They have diversified from rubber and tea and cocoa and coconut to electronics and IT and wire harnesses and complex products. And 3 percentage points come from these products. And I'm going to give you an example that you're going to hold your head in your hands. Sri Lanka. I'll give you an example for Thailand. In the last 15 years, Thailand introduced 70 new products that showed up in the atlas, the Harvard Atlas is what's called the RCA, meaning there is some significant amount of trade taking place. 70 new products, per capita $326. Vietnam, 48 products, and each bringing in $545 per capita. And Sri Lanka, 7 new products, bringing in $5 per capita. Now you see, unless we make some changes, this is not sustainable. So how do we do it? It hasn't happened naturally. The more we look inwards, the more we say we don't want to integrate, the further we are going to be away from our target. We need technical expertise, we need investments. I want to go back to Ricardo, who mentioned this a couple of times, taking Scrabble as an analogy. Right? So, knowledge, expertise, or know-how is crucial for growth and development. So think of a letter or unit as know-how and a word as a product. So if you have 3 words, SRI, you can get 2 products. Every community, every country, every home is limited by the knowledge and the know-how that unit has. So in this case, you can make Sir and Sri, if Sri is a word. If you had Sri Lanka, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 were letters, that much of know-how, but of course it is repeated. Then you can make 182 words. And more valuable words, longer words, that you can get double score and triple score in Scrabble. So if we are restricted by policies of the state or the attitudes of the people or the chance of the opposition that we must close this country and keep away the technology that comes in, which is absolutely essential to move from a simple, low productive country to a complex, high productive and high wage country, then we can forget about it. Another very important point that I want to make is that we talk about production networks. I'm sure we heard this before. Production networks have 2 different types of production networks. I refer to an amazingly rich paper by our friend Premachandra Tukorala. Can download it Manufacturing Exports from Sri Lanka, Opportunities, Achievements and Policy Options at the ANU, who talks about the need to move from buyer-driven to producer-driven production networks. Now, what are we talking about? Trade is dynamic and in intra-industry value chains, meaning intermediate goods are the ones that trade the most. You heard the explanation, or rather the example of the Apple phone and so on, how many times it moves borders before it is actually finalized and sold in the retail store. And it moves as intermediate product, right? So these numbers are from the global merchandise trade. Now in the case of buyer-driven, is you have a buyer, the buyer tells you, this is what I want, can you produce it for me? Yes, sure, we can do it. Here it is. Now, if what we are producing can be produced in 100 other countries, and we are competing only on price, as the country grows, as we develop, as our wages rise, can we compete? We cannot. Some of you yourselves have moved your operations to other countries that wages are much cheaper than here. So it is risky to be in buyer-driven networks. We need to move to producer-driven production networks. Producer-driven networks are more technology and capital intensive, with technology and production expertise needed in-house. So that is where we are looking at FDIs, that is where we are looking at innovations locally or otherwise, with copyright and what's the word I'm looking for? Ownership of knowledge. Yeah. 5 minutes, yeah. So if you look at the contribution of buyer-driven networks versus producer-driven networks and look at Sri Lanka compared to these countries, you see that it is of critical importance that we shift gears. So, coming to the end, what are we doing? We are going to engage in greater trade and investment agreements. There are people who are even criticizing the Singapore FTA. And I tell those people, please don't be misled by cheap political nonsense. We need the investments to come in. We need to lower the border taxes so that the production networks can become a reality in this country. We need to lower the barriers that we have erected at the borders. If we erect a barrier at the border, it becomes less conducive to become a part of the network. It will go to another country that has lower barriers at the border. So that is why we are removing para-tariffs and border restrictions. The new immigration regulations are coming. The cabinet has approved it. We will have visas that will help companies employ specialists and others. That will help transfer technology, either within FTAs or outside FTAs. Special economic zones, of course, Port City folks are here, Hambantota folks are here, Bingiriya, Charlie Mount, Trincomalee, various other special economic zones will come up. Sustainable investment incentives without giving carte blanche tax incentives for the rest of the life of the company. A 200% capital allowance or 300% capital allowance allows you, if you invest $100 million, $50 million, let's say $100 million, that you don't have to pay any taxes until you make $200 million in profits or $300 million in profits if you are investing in difficult areas in the north. Ease of doing business reforms, innovation and entrepreneurship. So the last slide, I'm not going to go deep into this, but the National Export Strategy has been launched by the MODSIT, and they've identified ITM and BPM services, electrical and electronic components, boat industry, wellness tourism, processed food and beverages, spices and concentrates. I'm not necessarily saying that these would be the ones that will take us from where we are to the diversified, complex market that we are looking for. But at least the EDB has done research to determine that these might be good bets. So to end from where I started, it is about integrating, it is about shifting gears from inward looking to outward looking. It is about taking the challenge on, and it is certainly not about erecting more walls around this country. It is certainly not the way forward. Shifting gears has to be something that is meaningful to us, so that ultimately this will help our people improve their standard of living. This is just a slide that I put to show that Sri Lanka is still not yellow, it's still white. Soon all these countries will get together. It is called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. If we can't even sign one agreement with one country, how are we going to sign agreements with ASEAN plus 6 countries? So think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harsha. Harsha, it's very interesting that you have been chosen to deliver this talk. I mean, you were Deputy Minister for Finance, Foreign Affairs, and then moved on to national policies, and I think that's very appropriate given your background. Now, you spoke about exports, but in the last 3 years that since your government has taken office, if you look at the metrics, they don't give a very promising picture. Trade deficit is up, external debt has grown, growth rate is hovering around 3%, rural economy contribution to GDP is declining, spending on education as a percentage of GDP that your government promised would be 6 is hovering at 2, same for health, and most frighteningly, in the Global Competitiveness Index, we have slipped from 68th to 85th, while all other countries in South Asia, Bhutan has gone up 15 places, Nepal 10, Pakistan 7, Bangladesh 7. So in keeping the topic of fast track, I would think far from gathering steam and forging ahead, it looks like the train is stuttering and hardly left the station. Now, you spoke about exports, and I'm glad you spoke about the CDI, the CID, which is the study that your government commissioned, I believe. And they speak about exports, and you did say about Vietnam, 45 goods, we had 7, so they have grown their exports 35-fold. Now, one of the things that the same report points out, and this is appropriate because you're State Minister for Policy, is that they talk about binding constraints, those constraints that if you focus on and improve even marginally, you will have tremendous impact on growth. Now, the thing they say is, the business in Sri Lanka faces serious constraint from frequent and unpredictable changes in tax policy, extending to trade policy, and to a lesser extent to land policy. Now, why is this government not able to have consistent policy?